They handed me an iPad at check-in, and I stared at it like it was a stranger asking me to prove my worth. My fingers trembled. I tapped, swiped, nothing worked. The young man behind the counter rolled his eyes, then looked past me like I didn't exist. Inside, the music was loud, the lights too bright, and my name didn't belong on anyone's lips. I stood beside the dessert table, holding a gift I wrapped myself the paper a little wrinkled from the rain. No one spoke to me. When I tried to pay using my old iPad mini, the screen froze. A small circle spun in place, and I wished I could disappear with it. My daughter-in-law whispered something to my son. He came over and said it might be better if I left early. I did. I left soaking wet carrying a tote bag with his company logo. The same bag I gave him when he had nothing but a dream and my full heart behind it. Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. I still remember the way the lights shimmered off the glass windows of the downtown convention center. Evan had told me to dress nicely, but not too formal. It was the launch night for his startup's newest product, something sleek and smart I didn't fully understand. Still, I was proud. My son had built something from nothing. That alone made me feel like I had done something right. At the front entrance, a young woman with a headset handed me an iPad and told me to scan the QR code sent to my phone. I stared at the screen, confused. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to find the camera app. The girl gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, then leaned toward another staff member and whispered not quite softly enough that I must be a VIP from the Stone Age. I forced a smile and looked down. My fingers fumbled across the screen. I tapped something, but the screen froze. The young woman sighed and took it from my hands, tapping quickly before handing it back. Behind me, someone chuckled. Inside, the room sparkled. There were tall cocktail tables, sleek black tablecloths, branded displays glowing in blue, and projections of the product dancing across the walls. People moved smoothly, drinks in hand, conversations flowing. I looked for Evan. I spotted him across the room laughing beside Chelsea, his wife. She was in a silver dress, her blonde hair curled perfectly. She saw me and her smile dropped for just a second, like she had hoped I wouldn't come. No one came up to greet me. I wandered toward a dessert table, trying to stay out of the way. I overheard two young men talking about investor rounds and Series B funding, words that meant nothing to me. I reached for a small cupcake and stood quietly, pretending to check my phone. I didn't want to seem like I was just standing there alone. I thought maybe I could buy a small gift from the booth at the corner, something with Evan's company name on it. They had these little iPad minis at the counter. A woman behind the table told me I could scan my card and tap through the screen to pay. I nodded and tried to follow her instructions. I tapped too hard. The screen glitched, then froze again. Someone behind me muttered, not even trying to whisper, "She can't even handle an iPad." The woman behind the counter smiled awkwardly and said she'd handle it manually. I apologized and stepped back. A moment later, Chelsea appeared beside Evan. She pulled him slightly to the side, but I was close enough to hear her whisper loud and clipped, "Your mom is hurting your image. People are starting to talk." Evan didn't respond right away. He looked over at me. I gave him a small wave. He turned back to Chelsea, said something I didn't catch, then walked toward me. "Mom, maybe it's better if you leave a little early tonight. It's just, everything's kind of crazy and we don't want you to feel overwhelmed." He didn't meet my eyes. I wanted to say something, to ask why I came at all, but I just nodded. My voice wouldn't come. I walked to the coat check. My hands felt cold. I didn't put on my jacket right away. Outside, it had started to rain. A thin drizzle at first, then heavier. I didn't have an umbrella. I clutched the canvas tote bag they'd given all the guests. It had Evan's company logo on it. I'd kept the first one too, the one he printed at home with an iron-on kit when he first launched the idea in our garage. I had helped him fold the first orders. He was 22 then. I stood under a bus shelter, staring out at the streetlights reflected in the wet pavement. Cars passed. Music echoed from inside the building behind me. My shoes were soaked. I didn't know where to go next. I didn't want to go back to their house, to the guest room that no longer felt like mine. They had made it clear. I didn't belong in their world anymore. Not on this night. Maybe not any night. There was a time when I understood wires better than people. Back in the early '80s, I served in the military as an electronics technician. My hands were steady, my eyes sharp. I soldered circuit boards under fluorescent lights for hours, making sure every connection was tight, every frequency aligned. That smell of heated resin still clings somewhere in my memory. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. In a room full of men, I was the one they called when something shorted out. After I left the service, I didn't stop working. I took on small jobs at repair shops, then later at a local trade school helping veterans train in basic electronics. I liked teaching. I liked the way someone's face would light up when the numbers finally made sense. And then Evan was born and everything shifted. My husband Carl was a quiet man. He worked nights at the freight yard and loved nothing more than sitting on the porch with a cold beer after work. We didn't have much, but we managed. When Evan turned 6, Carl gave him a screwdriver set. I gave him an old transistor radio and told him to open it up and find the heart of it. He sat at the table for hours. That was the first time I saw the same concentration I used to have in the service now in his little hands. Then Carl died. Stroke. Sudden. Evan was only 12. I didn't get a chance to grieve. There wasn't time. Bills had to be paid, and a boy had to be raised. I went back to work full time. I sold my car. Took the bus every morning. Ate dinner standing by the stove while Evan did his homework on the kitchen counter. When he said he wanted to study computer science, I told him we'd find a way. I cashed in Carl's pension. Took early withdrawal from my own retirement fund. And I bought him his first laptop. It wasn't the best model, but it was enough. He used it until the keys faded. I remember coming home from work once hearing him shouting in joy because he finally built a basic game from scratch. He made a little cartoon dog bark when you clicked it. It was ridiculous. I cried in the hallway before stepping in. When he got into see Santa Cruz, I hugged him so tight he laughed and said I was going to break his ribs. I let the house go and moved into a smaller apartment to help cover tuition. I packed lunches for him when he came home on weekends. He always acted like it was no big deal, but he never left any food behind. After he graduated and got that first internship, we celebrated with frozen pizza and a bottle of store-brand root beer. I told him how proud I was. He looked embarrassed but smiled. Then a few years later, he met Chelsea. She wasn't a bad person. Just polished. She always had something smart to say and a camera-ready smile. She talked about brand alignment and audience engagement and what kind of image Evan should present. I tried to keep up, but I knew I wasn't part of that picture. After they got married, they invited me to live with them. At first, it felt like an honor. I had my own room, my own bathroom. I helped take care of their baby-cooked dinner, folded laundry, kept the house clean while they worked late or traveled. Chelsea said it helped them a lot, and I believed her. But slowly, the house changed. My dinners were replaced with meal deliveries that were more photogenic. Chelsea started filming kitchen routines and asked me to stay out of the background. She said the lighting didn't flatter me. The baby began calling her nanny mama by accident, and Chelsea laughed, then made a face when I tried to correct him. I started eating alone not because anyone told me to, but because I didn't know where I fit anymore. Evan stopped asking how my day was. He talked about pitch meetings and tech trends and customer acquisition. I nodded along, but my words felt clumsy beside his. One day, I found an old soldering kit in the garage and left it on the counter thinking it might make him smile. He moved it aside and placed his iPad there instead. I got the message. I wasn't angry. Just quiet. I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. They build new lives. But I also told myself sometimes in the silence before bed that maybe I'd stayed too long. Maybe I was just taking up space. Still, I kept showing up. I helped when they needed me. I smiled when I was supposed to. And I tried not to notice how often they forgot I was in the room. It started with small things, the kind that slip past you if you're not paying attention. One day, I walked into the living room while Chelsea was setting up her phone on a ring light. She was preparing for a live stream talking about tech hacks for busy moms. I asked if she wanted help with the lighting. She smiled thinly and said it was okay. Maybe I could stay in the kitchen while she filmed. The next week, I baked Evan's favorite casserole, the one I used to make when he had midterms. Chelsea opened the oven, blinked at the smell, and closed it again. Later, she quietly tossed it out and replaced it with something from a delivery service that came in sleek packaging and matched her color scheme. She didn't say anything cruel, just a soft suggestion that their brand was moving in a lighter, healthier direction. The fridge filled up with green juices and labeled containers. My leftover stew was moved to the back and forgotten. I kept cooking, but less. It felt like playing piano in a room where no one listened. One afternoon, I put on an old blouse, deep blue with small embroidered flowers near the collar. It was the one I wore on my wedding anniversary, the year Carl gave me a soldering iron instead of roses. Evan had been 10, then grinning through mashed potatoes as Carl and I danced in socks across the kitchen tiles. Chelsea saw me in that blouse and paused. She tilted her head and said gently that the color was a bit heavy. Maybe I'd feel better in something brighter. Something cheerful. Something less dated. I didn't say anything. Just went back upstairs and folded it neatly back into my drawer. The next morning, it was gone. I never asked where it went. Over time, the house seemed to grow smaller, not in size, but in the space I was allowed to occupy. My knitting basket disappeared from the living room. The baby's toys I had organized in little bins were moved to another room. The plants I watered were replaced with artificial ones because they photographed better. Even the smell of cinnamon I used to fill the kitchen with was masked by diffusers that sprayed clean linen every 15 minutes. Then one night, I received a text from Evan. It was short. He said it would help if I stayed in the downstairs part of the house during the weekdays, just until they wrapped a few content projects. He added a smiley face at the end. I stared at the screen for a long time. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. But I felt something settle in my chest, heavy and cold. I typed a reply, then deleted it. I placed the phone face down and sat quietly at the edge of my bed. It was like watching yourself disappear one small request at a time. No shouting. No doors slammed. Just silence. Clean and polite. Almost elegant in how completely it erased you. It was a Saturday evening and the house smelled like artificial vanilla and expensive candles. Chelsea had spent the whole week preparing for a gathering she called an industry mixer, though it looked more like a networking party for people who all had perfect teeth and matching phone cases. I offered to help earlier that day, but she gently declined. I was told to enjoy the night and just relax. I stayed quiet standing near the hallway, watching guests glide through the kitchen balancing wine glasses and canapés. Most of them barely looked in my direction. I felt like part of the furniture, something old and practical, but out of place among polished metal and white walls. I had poured myself a glass of red wine and was trying to make room on the marble counter when my elbow nudged a tray. The glass tipped. Red liquid spread quickly over the surface, dripping down onto Chelsea's printed guest cards. I froze. For a second, no one moved. Then I heard her heels click across the floor. She saw the mess and inhaled sharply, but it wasn't shock. It was fury dressed in restraint. She reached for napkins but didn't hand them to me. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You are the reason I hate hosting anything. Every single time. The room went silent. A few guests turned away, pretending not to notice. One woman checked her phone. Another cleared her throat and sipped her drink. Evan stood nearby staring at the floor. He didn't say a word. I looked at him just once, long enough to hope for something. Maybe a quiet that's enough. Maybe a small hand on my arm. But nothing came. His hands were in his pockets. His lips pressed together. I felt my face burn. I nodded slightly and stepped away from the counter. No one followed. No one asked if I was okay. I walked into the kitchen and opened the sink. There were wine glasses piled inside their stems, tangled like they'd been forgotten in a rush. I started washing them slowly, one by one. The running water was loud enough to drown out the voices in the other room. The cold from the faucet bit into my skin. I didn't cry loudly. I didn't break anything. I just let the water rinse over my hands while my chest pulled tight. It wasn't the spilled wine that hurt. It was how quickly the people who once needed me had learned to live like I wasn't there. The kitchen light flickered for a second. I didn't fix it. I dried my hands on the towel and kept moving through the glasses. The sound of laughter returned faintly from the next room. I couldn't tell if Evan was still there. I didn't want to know. The room smelled like old plastic and damp blankets. The kind of scent that lingers in places meant to be temporary but always feel permanent. The woman at the front desk gave me a clipboard, asked a few questions, and handed me a key without looking up again. I didn't blame her. I didn't know what kind of story she thought I had, but I was too tired to offer one. The bed was narrow, a metal frame with chipped paint, and a mattress that sank in the middle. There was a folded blanket at the foot the color of oatmeal, and a small pillow that felt like it had never been fluffed. I sat down slowly, listening to the springs complain beneath me. Across the hall, someone coughed hard again and again. It sounded dry, deep, and lonely. The light above me flickered twice before holding steady. I didn't unpack anything. I hadn't brought much. Just a canvas tote and a change of clothes folded inside an old grocery bag. I placed the tote at my feet and leaned back against the wall. There were no photos here. No smells of garlic and onion from the kitchen. No small hands tugging at my sleeve. Just the low hum of fluorescent lighting and the occasional shuffling of tired feet on old tile. I closed my eyes and tried to remember something soft. Carl's voice. Evan's laughter when he was still small. But even those memories felt out of place here, like songs from another station playing too far in the background. I kept thinking about that night at the house. The look on Evan's face. The way he didn't defend me. The way Chelsea's voice cut through the room like I wasn't standing there at all. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a problem they couldn't fix anymore. A reminder of a past they didn't want in their present. I thought about going back, knocking on the door and pretending like none of it happened. But the truth was, I didn't know if the door would even open. And if it did, I didn't know if I'd be welcome on the other side. The coughing across the hall got louder, then stopped. Then silence. I lay down slowly, turning to face the wall. The metal of the bed pressed cold against my hip. I pulled the thin blanket over my shoulder and stared at the chipped paint. I felt like it was peeling in the same pattern as my life, small pieces coming loose without warning. For the first time in a long time, I had no one waiting for me. No one texting to ask if I'd be home for dinner. No child needing help with homework. No kitchen to clean or stories to read. Just this room. And a key that didn't mean anything. I pressed my hands together under my cheek. My eyes stayed open. It was quiet. So quiet that even my thoughts sounded too loud. And in that stillness, a sentence surfaced. Quiet, sharp, cruel. Maybe I don't belong anywhere. I walked into the library because it was warm. That was all I needed that morning. Just a place with quiet corners walls, lined with stories, and heat that didn't come from guilt or pity. I didn't expect anything more. I wandered past the computers, letting my fingers graze the backs of chairs until I saw a sign taped to the wall near the study rooms. It read Tech Basics for Seniors. Thursdays and Fridays. No registration required. I paused. Not because I thought I belonged, but because something about those words felt soft. Like an open door, I wasn't sure I could walk through. Inside the room, there were folding chairs, a whiteboard, and a table full of old Chromebooks. A young woman with a ponytail and a badge labeled Digital Literacy Intern was adjusting cables. Two older men sat up front, chatting about their grandchildren. In the corner, two girls, maybe college students, scrolled through their phones and laughed too loudly. I caught a glance from one of them, then a whisper. She thinks she can code. I pretended not to hear. I had heard worse. From people who mattered more. I moved to the last row and took a seat by the wall. The plastic chair creaked under my weight. I adjusted the screen of the Chromebook and waited. When the lesson started, I stayed quiet. I didn't raise my hand or offer stories. I just followed the motions. Left click. Right click. Open browser. Search bar. The instructor asked if anyone had ever used a command line. Most people shook their heads. I didn't. I waited until the room got quiet. Then slowly I typed something. Just a simple line. I remembered the syntax from years ago. It wasn't perfect, but when the cursor blinked and the screen responded, something inside me fluttered. I whispered it to myself without meaning to. I remember this? My hands weren't as fast as they used to be. My eyes needed the text a little bigger. But the logic was still there. Like a river that had dried up but remembered where to run. I opened a notepad window and typed out some basic HTML. A header. A paragraph. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The two girls stopped whispering. One leaned over, watching my screen from a few rows away. I didn't look back at them. I kept typing. The instructor came by and asked if I needed help. I shook my head and smiled. I hadn't smiled like that in weeks. Not the kind you wear to survive, but the kind that starts in your chest and reaches your eyes. That afternoon, I stayed after class. The room emptied out, and I asked if I could borrow the Chromebook for the week. The intern said yes. I signed a small form and held it close like it was made of gold. Back in the shelter that night, I sat on my bed with the device open on my lap. The light above my head buzzed, but I didn't notice. I was learning again. No, not learning. Remembering. And in that remembering, something opened. Not wide. Not loud. But real. The auditorium wasn't large, but to me it might as well have been a stadium. Rows of folding chairs filled with students, teachers, and a handful of curious community members stretched out before me. The lights were soft, and there was a warm hum of anticipation in the room. My name was printed on a small easel near the podium. Linda Monroe, guest speaker. Underneath it said tech for all generations. 6 months earlier, I was sleeping under a flickering ceiling light, holding onto a borrowed Chromebook like it was a lifeline. I never imagined I'd be standing here holding a microphone being asked to share a story I had once been too ashamed to tell. I began slowly. My voice wavered on the first sentence, but I found my footing in the silence. I told them about the war room I used to work in, the soldering iron I once held steadier than a pencil. I told them about my son, who I had raised to love wires, chips, and code. I told them how I had stepped aside willingly at first, and how invisibility creeps in quietly until it becomes the only thing you recognize. I didn't name names. I didn't tell them about Chelsea, or the dinner parties, or the night I stood washing glasses in silence. I just said I had been told I was no longer relevant, that I didn't belong in a world that was changing faster than my fingers could follow. And then I told them I didn't believe that. Not anymore. I spoke about learning again, about stumbling through logins and syntax and HTML mistakes, about failing and trying again. I told them that something changes inside you when you prove to yourself that you are still capable. Not to anyone else, just to yourself. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Not cold or uncertain, just full, like they had been holding their breath. Then came the applause. It wasn't loud, but it was long. And I stood there smiling, not with pride, but with peace. Someone recorded the talk. A girl in the front row asked to post it. I didn't think much of it. 2 days later, I was sitting at the library working on a small website for a senior coding group when the librarian walked over and said she had seen me on TikTok. I thought she was joking. Then a teenager at the next table turned his phone to show me a clip of my speech. It had subtitles, a hashtag, and over 1 million views. By the end of the week, I was coding grandma. My inbox was flooded. Messages from women in their 60s, men who had stopped learning after retirement, teenagers who said I reminded them of their grandma, but cooler. Reddit threads popped up with comments like, "I wish my mom had this kind of fire," or "She's the reason I signed up for community college." Evan called me 2 days later. I didn't pick up. He texted once. Just a link to the video with a single sentence, "Is this really you?" I didn't reply. That night, I searched my own name. I typed Linda Monroe into Google and hit return. There it was. Articles, screenshots, interviews I hadn't even agreed to. Thousands of comments. They didn't know my history. They didn't know the living room I used to clean or the family dinners I cooked without being thanked. They just knew my story now, the part I had written with my own hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as a mother, not as a mistake, not as a burden, just as someone who hadn't given up. The phone rang just after noon. I saw Evan's name on the screen and let it fade to voicemail. There was nothing angry in me, just calm, like a page that had already been turned. I didn't need to hear what he had to say to know why he was calling. That evening, I checked my email. The subject line was simple. From Chelsea. Just her name. I clicked it open, not knowing what I expected. It was short. She wrote that she saw the video, said I had inspired more people than I could imagine, that she was one of them. There was no excuse, no explanation. Just a quiet recognition that something in her had shifted. I read it twice. Then I closed the tab. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was mine. I didn't owe them anything. And that was the difference. Months ago, I would have responded immediately. I would have tried to smooth it all out, shrink myself into forgiveness. But not now. Now I had learned to sit with my own space. A week passed. It was a crisp Saturday morning. I took my usual walk to the park near the small apartment I was renting. There were children on scooters, dogs tugging at their leashes, a food truck steaming with coffee and waffles. I was about to sit on my bench by the pond when I saw them. Evan was standing near the old tree at the edge of the playground. His hands were in his coat pockets. Beside him was my grandson. His small hand held a paper bag, and he was looking at the ducks. Chelsea wasn't there. Evan didn't wave. He didn't move. Just stood there waiting as if he understood that this time I got to decide. I stood still for a long moment, letting the wind move through my sleeves, letting the space between us stay silent. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just less certain. Less tall in the way suns often seem when you're always looking up to reach them. I walked toward the bench, not away, not toward him, just to my place. I sat down and pulled out my thermos. He stayed there giving me the choice. That was enough for now, because this time I was the one who would choose when to speak. And if I didn't, the world would still turn just fine. My grandson was the first to move. He saw me sitting on the bench and walked over holding the paper bag in both hands like it was something precious. He asked if he could sit with me. I nodded, patting the empty space beside me. We watched the ducks for a while in comfortable silence. He reached into the bag and pulled out a small toy robot, one of those kids build and program. He turned to me and asked if I could show him how to make it move. His voice was soft, hopeful, not because he doubted I could do it, but because he really wanted to learn from me. I took the little robot from his hand and turned it over, scanning the ports, the wires, the small blinking light on the circuit board. I smiled and said we could start with the basics. His face lit up like I had given him the moon. That was enough. Evan walked over slowly. He kept his distance as if unsure how close was close enough. When he finally sat on the bench, he didn't say anything right away. Just watched us. I could feel his gaze shifting between me and his son, trying to find the right way in. Then he asked, his voice quiet, almost strained, "Why didn't you ever tell me you used to work in tech?" His eyes searched mine like there might still be time to rewrite the past. I looked at him calm and steady. "Because you were too busy showing the world who you were." The words came out soft without anger. Just truth. He didn't speak again. He just lowered his eyes and nodded slowly. There was nothing left to say. I had no need to correct him, no desire to make him feel smaller. This wasn't about regret or revenge. It was about release. He had finally stopped looking past me, and for the first time, truly saw me. I looked back at my grandson, who was already unpacking the robot parts onto the bench. I smiled and rested my hand on his. Evan stayed quiet beside me, letting the stillness hold us all together. The apartment wasn't much. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a window that looked out onto the park. But it was mine. In the mornings, I opened the curtains and let the light spill across the hardwood floor. I brewed coffee without having to be quiet for anyone. There was a peace in that small silence. I started working part-time at the community center. Twice a week, I taught a group of women how to use their phones, check email, set up video calls. Some of them came in afraid to even touch the screen. I told them what I told myself when I first started again. You're not behind. You're just beginning. They smiled when they left. I could see it. The quiet confidence. Like something locked away had finally been invited back to life. I didn't need applause anymore. Their progress was enough. Watching someone open a browser for the first time without fear felt like a victory. On the days I didn't work, I stayed in. I cooked recipes from old notebooks. I planted herbs in small ceramic pots along the windowsill. I read paperbacks from the library and sometimes reread passages just because they felt good to hear out loud. My hands weren't idle. My heart wasn't heavy. That was enough. Evan and my grandson came by every Sunday. They never stayed too long. Just enough for lunch and a walk around the block. We didn't talk about the past. Not the parties, not the silence, not the long nights in the shelter or the coding class or the speech that changed everything. We didn't need to. Chelsea never came. I didn't ask why, and Evan never explained. That, too, was fine. Some distances don't need to be closed. Some stories end quietly with space. I kept a drawer in the desk for small things. Dried lavender. A thumb drive with my class materials. A few letters from women who had taken my course. One day, my grandson slipped in a drawing of the robot we built together. I placed it next to the others and smiled. That drawer held pieces of my new life. Simple. Steady. My own. I didn't wake up every day feeling brave, but I woke up with purpose, and that made all the difference. It was a quiet morning, the kind that feels like it belongs only to you. The air smelled like coffee and the rosemary I had clipped from the window planter the night before. The sun slipped through the blinds and spilled across the table warm and steady. I pulled out a sheet of paper from the drawer and sat down with a pen I hadn't used in years. I didn't write often anymore. Most things didn't need to be said. But that morning, I felt the weight of a voice I had never fully let out. So I wrote not to Evan, not to Chelsea, not to the world. I wrote to her, to the woman I used to be, to the one who stood in the rain that night with a gift bag and a heart too bruised to speak, to the one who sat alone in a shelter bed wondering if her worth expired with her usefulness, to the one who wore her old wedding sweater and got told it made others uncomfortable. I wrote to remind her she was never the problem. They just stopped looking for her. I told her she was never outdated. She was simply uninvited. That her kindness was mistaken for weakness. That her silence was misunderstood as ignorance. That the world she helped build had no patience left for the hands that once held it up. I told her she didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed to keep going. That the pain would make her softer, not smaller. That the solitude wouldn't break her. It would finally make space for her. I told her she would find her way back, not to what she lost, but to something steadier. Something earned. A life that felt honest. A voice that no longer trembled just to be polite. When I finished the letter, I folded it once carefully. I opened the code notebook where I'd written my first lines again all those months ago. The notebook with creases on the corners and coffee stains near the middle pages. I placed the letter between the last two pages and closed it. Outside, the trees swayed gently. I could hear children laughing in the park. A delivery truck pulled up across the street, its brakes hissing in the quiet. I didn't need to read the letter again. I already knew every word. They had always been inside me waiting for the right moment. I sat back and let the light reach my face. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel sad. I just felt whole. And in that stillness, I smiled.